Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm Karen Langdon with the National Emergency Management Association, and I'd like to welcome you to the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series. We're very excited to showcase the expertise of some of our members in this series, and today we're happy to present the case for disaster response approach, why emergency management principles can help address complex and chronic crises. A big thank you to Whit O'Brien for supporting today's topic. Thank you again for being with us today. And now it's my pleasure to pass the session to our presenter, Scott Stormer, Managing Director of Readiness and Response with Whit O'Brien's. Welcome, Scott. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Karen, and thank you to the staff at NEMA for your important work, continuing to advance thought leadership in and around emergency management. Certainly the dynamic nature of our world of work really requires and warrants this kind of forum to help us learn and adapt to the changing world that we're in. So just for a little context, I've had the privilege of serving as an emergency manager for about 27 years. 25 of those years were spent with the Coast Guard as a response and maritime compliance officer with a focus on oil spills, hazardous materials, and all hazards incident management. It's a little strange and maybe kind of a full circle moment for me, as I can recall a period in the Coast Guard when we couldn't spell ICS. I don't know, perhaps there's some on the call today or some on the meeting today that can relate in some of their early days. And now I have the opportunity to talk to a group of professionals about our world of work. So if we go to the next slide, please. So all that to say that I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk through some ideas related to the application of emergency management. A couple of caveats as we begin today. First, know that these are working thoughts. They're not finally formed doctrine. I'm certainly not speaking for emergency management as a whole, but I really look forward to kind of the collective thoughts, the collective feedback related to the discussion today. Additionally, I'm not an elected leader, nor do I work in a civic leadership role. So that means I run the risk of kind of glossing over some of the complexities or maybe oversimplifying some of the things that leaders in that space face. Certainly not my intent, but for the purposes of illustration, hopefully the value of that conversation will be borne out through the discussion. So I certainly have, however, supported those leaders, just as many of you have, and believe that the application of emergency management principles to long-term, complex, chronic challenges really has some merit. So finally, although I do refer to Mayor Bass in Los Angeles, haven't worked with her for her firsthand, don't really have firsthand knowledge of some of that. My information is pulled from open source. So over the course of the next few minutes, I'd like to walk you through a few overarching thoughts, a little context, and then offer some considerations for the application of emergency management principles to complex challenges. Finally, we'll maybe talk through a couple of quick examples to illustrate, and certainly then close with questions, certainly any that you have or any that may already be posted in the chat at that point. If I could have the next slide, please. So shortly after her inauguration, Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass stated that she will start her first day as mayor in the city with the city's Emergency Operations Center, where her first act as mayor will be to declare a state of emergency on homelessness. Further, she noted that she will recognize the severity of the crisis and break new ground to maximize our ability to urgently move out and move people inside and do so for good. So here, it strikes me that the mayor's first action in office is a recognition of the value of emergency management and its potential benefit to a complex and chronic crisis that's facing the city. While not common, Mayor Bass's actions are maybe not unique. Similarly, Seattle activated similar protocols in response to homelessness within their municipality. I think that our collective lived experience also points to the fact that many states and municipalities across the country attempted similar emergency management activations in response to COVID. I also feel that our collective experience bears out the fact that emergency management, or EM, during COVID was a mixed experience, and in most cases it had mixed results. So I found myself asking the question, is the mayor right? What aspects of emergency management is she hoping to bring to bear on the crisis, and to what end? Emergency management is many things, but it's not any one individual emergency managers or any one individual emergency manager. Emergency management is a set of principles and even a philosophical framework that, when applied, can help address problems. A slide that listed all of the characteristics of emergency management would go on forever. But here, a few bullets bring to mind some of that fabric of emergency management. While we'll dive into a few of these points a little bit later, the goal here is to bring the character of emergency management to the forefront of your mind. Many of you might be familiar with the 100 Resilient Cities initiative. Originally, it was supported by the Rockefeller Foundation, and this initiative created a resilience network to help cities meaningfully adopt and institute resilience. I highlight it here because disaster planning and disaster preparedness were key pillars of their work. They work to support capacity to prepare, withstand, and emerge stronger from whatever shock came to a city's way. Especially, their focus was on long-term complex challenges. So for our discussion today, I think it's important to point out that emergency management as a set of operating principles is really a tool that should be considered to help address complex chronic challenges and how to deal with them. So the next slide, please. So having set up a little bit of background, let's expand on some of the ideas of emergency management principles. Again, not a focus on emergency managers or the emergency manager, but on some of the core features of emergency management as a suite of operating tenets. So as described, emergency management principles are not a solution. And I use a solution in quotation marks. Emergency management isn't a solution in and of itself, but rather it's an approach, right? Or a method for solving situations and problems. This approach, refined over our years and our work as emergency managers, represents really a mindset and a set of guiding and operational principles that can be brought to bear on incidents and crises of increasing or modifying magnitude. When combined with appropriate operational tactics, emergency management creates an environment for successful incident problem solving. Emergency management principles are not a magic bullet. As mentioned, they don't solve things on their own. So certainly emergency management is broadly applicable, but it's not a universal key, especially given the fact that its processes and lexicon might not be as well known as we want yet. Moreover, emergency management principles do not represent some kind of arithmetic solution where 2 + 2 = 4, but rather a set of principles, again, that can provide a framework for the complex calculus that is necessary to solve multifaceted problems. I think the axiom, perhaps paraphrased a little, that a complex problem doesn't happen overnight, therefore can't be solved overnight, seems to apply. Emergency management principles are certainly not without opportunity cost. The most effective implementation of emergency management requires resources and time. While this is certainly true of other approaches or other solutions to problems, I bring it up here because it certainly has to be part of any official's evaluation of the risks and benefits to the way they're going to address a problem. While the use of an EOC and emergency management staff might already be a sunk cost, right? They already exist. We're already paying people on staff. It's certainly true that the other members of that unified coordination group or team, as well as emergency managers, have day-to-day jobs. Moreover, in some cases, while a formal state of emergency might compel participation, that still doesn't take away from the day jobs or the regular routine requirements and obligations of the other members of the team that would be required to solve a problem. And so finally, I'll also note that emergency management principles are not ICS. And ICS is certainly not emergency management. Among other things, emergency management is does set up the framework for that structure. It does set up the framework for the necessary communications and certainly the necessary coordination. And ICS is a tool to harness and apply those things, but it is the circumstances by which that's applied that I'd like us to think about today. So I think that brings us to the other side of the coin. So let's talk about what emergency management principles are. If we go to the next slide, please. So as just highlighted, emergency management principles are much, much more than ICS. It's all too common, especially with our interagency partners, that emergency management principles and ICS are often considered synonymous. I think, unfortunately, this creates an erroneous and, to a certain extent, maybe fatalistic assumption that one has to be an ICS expert in order to, and steeped in the terminology, in order to successfully employ emergency management's tools and benefits. Emergency management focuses on the coordination and the management of resources and responsibilities pertaining to issues. And I think those principles are broadly applicable. ICS is but a tool in that emergency management toolbox. Emergency management principles and emergency management is oriented around common purpose. The mission focus of emergency management, and more specifically of the organization that it creates to solve problems, can bring a level of attention that might not exist when personnel and processes are tackling disparate lines of day-to-day effort. So when things are coalesced around a plan, maybe an incident action plan, but it certainly could take other names, that single formal point source of documentation that defines incident goals, incident objectives, and strategies as defined by a quote unquote command connects the team. It creates common vision, creates common intent, strategy, and processes. And in many cases, that can be to the elimination or to the with a hyper focus on those efforts, kind of clearing away the ambiguity, right? Clearing away some of those things that might otherwise be occurring on the margins, refining our ability to energize around a problem. So that's certainly not to say that those other lines of effort aren't important, but I think it more speaks to the point that the hyper focus that's created by emergency management and an emergency management oriented organization really brings emphasis to where that emphasis might not otherwise exist, or it might get muddled or lost in the enormity or the complexity of a problem. Not that they used emergency management principles specifically, but I'm reminded of perhaps the Mercury and the Apollo projects, programs of the 1960s, where I think it's certain to say that we would have landed on the moon at some point, but would it have been on the same time frame without the hyper focus? Again, not without opportunity cost, but that ability to focus on a singular problem, develop the strategies and tactics that we're going to use to measure our progress towards those things, I think is really kind of clear in that example. So we'll paraphrase Confucius here. The management of 1,000 problems begins with a single objective. While Confucius probably wasn't an emergency manager, I think he was onto something in kind of our modern parlance and our modern sense of the word. I think his quotation here draws value to the measured and measurable steps toward an end, and so too is emergency management, focused on objectives. That core principle of emergency management really defines and outlines that iterative approach to objectives, which we might coin as management by objectives. While it might seem intuitive, I think we're often lost when we look at complex problems because of the enormity of the scenario, of the situation, the complexity, the interrelationships that might exist as a function of a complex chronic problem or challenge. But nonetheless, those same complex challenges can be addressed through the methodical tackling of a series of smaller milestone objectives, over the course of some period of time. Emergency management and its cyclical approach to individual objectives really allows officials to work through finite problems that are oriented at overall goals without being lost in the immensity of that overarching set of challenges or even the big objectives. I think emergency management is time aware. And I think that is a principle of emergency management that applies to a discussion of complex chronic challenges. This core principle of emergency management is that time is important. And it's not only that the speed of a response matters, but that kind of irreversible succession of past to present or past to future creates a sense of urgency. So that urgency oriented around a mission, I think, is really one of the tenets of emergency management that applies to this discussion. A part of emergency management process is time that's measured in operational periods, as we all know. And those operational periods are scalable based on the nature and the needs and the requirements of an emergency or an incident. And certainly during those operational periods, the officials and those involved implement a plan, and then they measure, and then they gauge, and they report progress, they assess gaps and needs, and then they prepare for the next cycle. Why is a complex challenge any different? The incident establishes the timeframes, whether it's hours, days, weeks, months, and that serves as an effective operational period, not only for that activity, but to facilitate measured progress towards future goals. I think another facet of emergency management principles that are important for us to highlight here today is that we have assigned responsibility and accountability within emergency management. So another hallmark of ourselves and our programs as EM is that the organization, the span of control, and then this assignment of responsibility. While an organization is important, the purpose-built kind of task-oriented specific processes that are put in place are very often fluid and they change with the nature of the organization. That's one of the strengths of our processes. So that fluidity is necessary to meet changing needs. But one of the things that I would highlight that's not fluid is the importance of the assignment of responsibility for the objectives to individuals as part of the iterative process in our operational periods as we go forward. This basically ensures that the plan is being implemented and that effective, measured, progressive operational planning occurs over the course of some period of time and a series of successive operational periods. So, because I think we've all seen that broad thoughts about a team that should do something or an individual that should do something are really not enough. And I think that's especially true in the face of a complex problem. If we consider a simple example, right? If we consider a house fire, if someone wasn't assigned to a hose, even with all the resources that are amassed around that incident and all the experience and all the capability, if someone's not assigned to that hose to actually do something with it, we're not really making any progress. And maybe no water would even be sprayed. And that assignment and that accountability, I think, really speaks in complex problems as well, because of the need to really make measured progress towards, in some cases early on, maybe small scale goals that over the course of time amass to large objectives. We know that one of emergency management's key strengths is its ability to operate across functional and organizational lines. We bring together cross-functional teams, cross-organizational teams, cross-jurisdictional teams all the time. And complex challenges really fit into this because complex challenges can never and are never owned by a single solution set, right? Or an organization that has a single way of solving a problem. So emergency management is really designed to, for a period of time, obscure the lines or lessen the barriers between organizations and jurisdictions for the purpose really of accomplishing a shared objective. And so it's not to say that organizations in a unified management organization don't have their own internal priorities, responsibilities, requirements, because certainly they do. However, one of the purposes of and one of the values of emergency management is its ability to align those jurisdictions, authorities, et cetera, to who can do what, when, and where, and really bring that to bear through emergency management principles and processes. I think this aligns purpose, harmonizes effort, and it certainly reduces, organizational duplication of effort. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Let's return, if we can, to Mayor Bass and the complex chronic challenge of homelessness. So why did the mayor either feel the need or why did the mayor activate the city's emergency management infrastructure to coordinate a service for her population that, really there are other aspects of her that her government are really kind of built around that as a core purpose or as a requirement. And again, while I certainly don't have firsthand knowledge of the mayor's thought process or the decision process, I think, if we opine briefly on the application of emergency management principles to this type of crisis, perhaps it sheds a little light there. So ending homelessness, and again, at risk of oversimplifying and not my intent, but ending homelessness, which is a seemingly intractable problem, really requires common purpose and organizational focus. It requires the benefit of defined and achievable objectives that certainly might start small and perhaps even relatively simple, but can grow and will grow over time and with additional operational momentum. So if we can break homelessness down into smaller, achievable milestones, assign the responsibility and the necessary resources to someone, we start to implement solutions to those complex and large-scale problems. So in this case, we really want to bring the right resources, which are certainly going to be cross-functional and multidimensional in nature, to address objectives, and then plan against some operational period background, whatever makes sense for the incident. So is that likely on the order of weeks or months in the case of, a large-scale complex problem? We want to effectively develop strategies to tackle those objectives, execute, adjust, and report back. And then once those objectives are achieved, we monitor and we move on to the next thing. Now, I don't want to discount, the political aspects of things here, certainly, and the explicit declaration that an emergency brings an issue to the forefront in terms of communication to the citizenry, and that homelessness is a priority for Mayor Bass. But I certainly think that the state of emergency and the establishment of a Tiger team at the city's Emergency Operations Center really brings into focus the ability for emergency managers to bring together those cross-functional teams and begin to tackle those large-scale complex problems, not necessarily things that emergency managers traditionally would have been called in to counsel on, advise on, or work on. So as a second example, I reflect on my own experiences supporting clients during COVID, and I think I see a number of parallels here as well. So in one case specifically, a client was particularly focused, and as I think many of us were during the time, on the equitable delivery of vaccine and vaccine-related information, but really wasn't making the kind of headway that they wanted to, really wasn't addressing and moving the needle, no pun intended, with regard to their effort. And so while vaccinations in and of themselves might not be a complex chronic challenge, I think it speaks to the lack of trust, the lack of confidence that communities have had, supported or buoyed by their chronic disinvestment, where they were stifled, systematically disenfranchised parts of the community. That is certainly a complex chronic challenge. And so through the application of emergency management principles, specifically establishing a cross-functional team that was actually community involved, establishing tangible, measurable objectives that we were then really able to overcome some of those long-standing community barriers through this work in this community. Overcoming those long-standing community barriers required small, measurable steps that then grew and developed their own momentum over the course of time. And I think to a certain extent, the proof is in the pudding. In a couple of cases and a couple of census tracts, this helped elevate vaccination rates in the single digits to over 60%, raising some of those census tracts off the national least vaccinated lists that we're kind of working through and floating around at the time. And while it's certainly not the only factor that defined or influenced success, I can definitely say that the conversation about taking kind of lofty, unachievable, unmeasurable goals that existed in kind of discussion and really breaking those down into, even in some cases, minute, measurable steps that we could then iterate on over the course of week-long operational periods, really facilitated this transition from being mired in the ambiguity of this complex problem to really taking measurable steps towards making it better and starting to solve things. I think maybe even most importantly, the communication pathways and the steps that were involved in working through this really established opportunities to grow our resilience within these communities into the future, because now they're almost formal, and they're even exercised as part of routine public health engagement. Again, creating a more resilient, a more committed, more integrated community in this space. So I guess now like to go to the next slide, please. So I guess hopefully over a brief time together, you have been provided with maybe a slightly different perspective or a slightly larger perspective or lens through which our critical skill sets as emergency managers could be applied. I'm hopeful that as the awareness and the value and the power of emergency management continues to grow, I think that we will continue to see areas where this type of idea can be brought to leadership or can be brought to bear on complex challenges. We all know that emergency management streamlines government. It helps for a period of time get rid of organizational charts and organizational silos, and that trained emergency managers are really able to quickly bring others up to speed, as I think we learned during COVID, about the benefits and the value of emergency management principles and applying them. And that when you have the right authority to make decisions and you have the right agencies in your unified command or your unified coordination efforts and elements, we can really make progress on not only the traditional challenges of emergency management, the response and recovery to disasters, but really the response and recovery to these large-scale, complex problems and challenges that are faced by our communities. So I thank you for your time this afternoon. I really look forward to to any questions that you have, and I hope that you took something from the presentation today. So with that, I think we can go to the next slide and focus on any questions that you have. Thank you. Yeah, I've got a question or a comment here from Michael, and I appreciate that, Michael. Yeah, I would very much agree that emergency management principles as applied with other subject matter experts, really can help to tackle and support these large scale or largely complex challenges and problems. I think your example of the border is a good example, or is a good demonstration of large scale crises. In some cases, some of these challenges that we're discussing, they don't really look to have an end. In some cases, we can't really necessarily define a beginning. And I think it's the application of principles to those kinds of things that is really interesting for us to continue to investigate as we go forward.
I would just like to add, Scott,
please.
I think there is that ethical concern, as I noted there. I'm not sure how San Francisco is doing. I mean, if you look at the media, when it comes to their homeless problem, I don't know that they necessarily have valid solutions that are meeting everyone's needs within their jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
The border crisis has the much more distinct challenge of sending your problem somewhere else and putting emergency managers in that untenable position of creating a disaster somewhere else. I sort of that physician heal thyself kind of a thing, or however you want to look at it, do no harm. We can't really be in this position, I don't think. And I'll be candid, from a full transparency, one of your competitors is making a lot of money off of this, so you've got to, look at the idea that, well, we have created a crisis somewhere else, and we're going to need some consultants to come in and support, because we can't do it. We've run out of emergency management people, so we got to hire more people on. These are significant issues that politicians have to solve.
No, I completely agree with you. I completely agree with you. The hypothesis here, from my perspective, is that the way of thinking about solving, and maybe solving is the wrong word in some cases, right? Addressing, and maybe we'll never address the challenge in its totality or fully, because there are systemic reasons that some of the challenges exist, and that's not what emergency management. I agree with you. I don't think emergency management is the methodology to solve that, or the appropriate, or is even appropriate. But the way of thinking, and I believe that we have continued to see this, a maturation and the change in which emergency management is viewed, and the type of things that emergency management can be used to address. So from that set of operating principles, that kind of guiding principle framework that exists in our minds about how we would address things, I think is my key takeaway. Because it's not that the emergency, because I agree with you, there are places where it's not appropriate for an emergency manager to be front and center, right? Or for the emergency management staff to be front and center. But I do think that in some cases, the principles that we might use are appropriate in some of those cases. Thank you.
I'll add just one more final thing, and that is, I hope,
please,
the totality of what we do, specifically mitigation aspects, would be considered. So I think to your point, if you take it to the level that with EMs are experts at A, B, and C, the D, E, and F that we're experts at are how to make this better the next time, or not so bad, whatever you want to look at mitigation as. So mitigating homelessness, mitigating the border crisis adverse impacts to communities in the United States, mitigating fill in the blank, right? Fentanyl crisis, opioid this, cancer, human trafficking, pick your chronic systemic disaster. We
Yep.
certainly, not that we have solutions, but we have a good idea and a framework of how it could be done.
Yep.
And I hope someone would take all that into account, not just our response capabilities.
Thank you. That is, we are in lockstep and agreement on that point, and I appreciate your comment very much.
Hey, Scott, a quick question here that I think
Sure.
will kind of build off of what Michael was saying a little bit regarding the need for resource management, longer term political solutions and leadership. But I threw this in the chat as well, but cross-functional, cross-organizational communications, coordination, they're keys to employing the EM principles that you spoke about throughout the presentation here. Applying those principles to these chronic issues like Michael was just talking about. Should or could municipalities maybe cross-train other organizations that are involved in these chronic issues? Maybe it's public health, maybe it's whoever's in charge of homelessness, those kind of things, to be more effective and be able to kind of spread out those responsibilities and those processes to help with the issues.
Yeah, I think you highlighted a good point from the perspective of I know in many people's experience, we found ourselves in that translation capacity or that translation role. We find ourselves in that translation role all the time. I think with COVID in the forefront of folks' minds, that translation and understanding of those. Again, in some cases, it was tactical ICS that we were maybe communicating to folks. But in other cases, those broader ideas of emergency management, breaking problems down in this fashion, thinking through the milestones and the objectives, and working to communicate that for teams that had maybe never had that, I think was a lesson learned. It was certainly something that we did a lot of during COVID and the implementation of these things. As Michael referred to or just mentioned, right, the process of trying to make it better as we go forward. This is exactly one of the things that we're all working to prepare around and plan around, and even exercise around those training opportunities to grow awareness, grow understanding about what EM is, what EM isn't, and how it can be addressed to individual challenges or different kinds of emergencies.
Great, thank you. We've got another question, I think, here in the chat. Sure. From John Bocino. How different are EM principles or whole of community from generic tools like project management, enterprise risk management? Can you comment at all on that?
Sure. I think, John, you bring up a great point. I think you bring up a very kind of interesting line of discussion related to the integration of many of these things that have kind of grown up in separate silos over the course of our time, or separate, worlds of expertise. But how, as we look at them, we take pieces and parts or see the applicability of them. I think the fact that you highlight project management within your comment is important. I think that many of us, myself included, see a lot of the things that I do as an emergency manager through a project management lens, right? I think we view, and I'm not saying that they're necessarily fundamentally different in many cases, because I don't think they are. The management by objective and breaking down things into tasks is really no kind of, when you distill it down to its core, it's not necessarily any different than some of the things that project management teaches for people that become project managers, because I think that emergency managers to a certain extent are project managers. The same might not be true, the reciprocal of that might not be true in all cases, but I think you bring up an interesting point from the perspective of the applicability or the broader applicability of some of those other professional development kind of pathways to emergency management and some of these principles. Amy asked a question. Thank you for saying that to us a second time, Amy, bringing it to the forefront here. How do you tackle the politics from elected officials? I don't know that emergency management has a tackling of the politics perspective. Certainly, we can't negate. I don't believe we can negate the political the political as it occurs to incidents, as it occurs around events, as it occurs around incident management, incident and emergency management. In my own experience, it's really an opportunity to, or the thing that I try to do is just that influence, so that the elected leadership that we're discussing this with, the elected leadership that we're trying to solve problems, kind of on the behalf of themselves and the constituencies, that they understand the implications. Because I don't know that it's an incident or an emergency manager's role to step into that political fray. But we certainly have a role in which I believe incident managers and emergency managers are, working to help our elected leadership know and understand what's required, what needs to be done, how long is this going to take, what are the downstream effects for those kinds of things, and what kind of resources are going to be necessary for us to tackle a particular problem. And I think that's that interplay with politics and emergency management.
Yeah, I think maybe building off that question, Scott, is maybe, okay, what would next step? So if somebody wanted to go about this or step into this, like Mayor Bass did in LA, where would they start? I don't think there's any solid rules behind this, but as an EM professional, maybe you've got an idea.
Well, I mean, certainly every circumstance is different. Every circumstance is certainly dynamic, both at the municipal level, with all the differences that exist across all of our communities. I don't know that there's necessarily a place to start in terms of bringing emergency management principles to your complex problem at home. That's not. But what I hope is that we begin to think about more and more the values and the qualities that emergency management distills or instills, creates and establishes within our emergency management kind of frameworks, how we grow that in our communities, and how that can maybe be brought to bear as we influence discussions with emergency managers, our interoperable communities, the interagency within our home front, to talk about problems that they would consider bringing some of these emergency management principles to bear in kind of at home. Again, I don't know that it's like we're creating a starting block someplace and everybody launches forward on something like this. I think it's really more of a lens by which we can look through the value and the power of the things that we bring to bear as EM at the other areas that they might be applicable.
Great. I think, maybe one more question here that would likely apply to everybody here. And that's going to be about funding. Funding, whether it's federal, local, is it possible, advisable to take non-EM funding to some of these chronic, non-traditional EM issues?
The answer is as myriad as the scenarios that we're discussing, to be quite honest. And nothing immediately comes to mind in terms of the application of individual funding on some of these things outside of the area that I know that we're all, as emergency managers, involved in, routinely with regard to applications for grants and participation in grants in the myriad of spaces that we work in that fund our activities and our efforts. So I don't know that it's a kind of thinking through direct to funding kind of approach. But again, that overarching lens, that overarching aspects of emergency management that we can use as a part of our day-to-day, as many of us are even involved in talking about some of these complex challenges that are facing our communities on a day-to-day basis.
Well, first I want to thank Whit O'Briens for supporting today's session, and for Scott, thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Also, thank you to everyone for participating today. You can find out more about the NEMA Empowerment e-learning series and how to sponsor one of your own in the resources section of the NEMA website at nemaweb.org. Thank you again for attending today. Take care, stay well, and have a productive rest of your day.